I'll continue with my introduction. I was in the middle of introducing Sharon Flanagan, who is our wonderful neuropsychologist here to talk to us about the topic of ambiguous loss. And I was in the middle of explaining why we've chosen this topic to talk about today in the context of brain injury and becoming a carer for a person with brain injury. One of the biggest topics that comes up when I'm talking with carers and trying to provide some level of support to carers is that carers are going through a grieving process of the loss of the relationship with the person that they were looking after before the brain injury occurred, whether that's an intimate romantic relationship, whether it's a parent-child relationship, a sibling relationship. It has changed as a result of the individual's brain injury. And I think it's important that we talk about that, because that's how we are able to grow in ourselves and become more caring carers to continue in that journey, because hiding from those difficult conversations is perhaps not helpful to anyone. So I knew that I wasn't going to be able to talk about this topic. I don't have the skills and the language to talk about it. So I reached out and was able to find the wonderful Sharon, who's very lovely to donate her time to us today to come and talk on this topic. Sharon was going to ask some questions throughout. So we have a great big group here in the Parramatta office today. When they answer a question, Sharon will repeat the question. And anyone interested in posting a question on the YouTube live stream, please do so, and I'll pop up and swap the microphone around with Sharon and ask that question on your behalf. So welcome, Sharon, and thank you very much.
My pleasure, absolutely. Oh, good, I don't have to. So question time at the end, you're saying?
Whenever you...
Of people asking me questions? Yes. Okay, great. Yes, okay. I've never done this hubs and YouTube and goodness knows what else before, so I'm going to be looking to Lauren to direct me if I'm doing something that doesn't fit with the platform that we have today. But first of all, I want to thank Lauren and thank everyone here and at the hubs for attending, because this is a tricky subject and some people may not want to hear about it. And I also know that as carers, and I'm sorry, I prepared this mainly for carers because I wasn't expecting other people to attend. But for carers, I know you're super busy, and one of the problems that can contribute to ambiguous loss is that you are so busy with your caring duties and you're not actually looking after yourself. And as we hear on the plane every time we get on, you know, when we hear about the oxygen mask coming down, they say, fit your own oxygen mask first, because otherwise you're no help to anyone else. So it really is important for you to look at what you need in order to stay as fit and healthy, both emotionally and physically and spiritually as you can. I'm hoping that this session will be very useful to the people watching, both now and in the future. I do have to give a heads up that it may stir up some distressing and uncomfortable feelings for some people because of the subject that we're dealing with. But I also hope that it'll bring some relief and some reassurance to you that these feelings are perfectly normal and in your situation and very valid and understandable. And as a clin psych, as well as a neuropsych, I can say that you can't manipulate your feelings just by wanting to. You can't just say, I want to be happy. If it was that easy, we'd all do it. But feelings are actually really important. They're like the nerves at the end of your fingers. You touch something hot and you take your hand away. They actually tell you something. They're a warning about something, or they tell you something about what's going on underneath. Because there's only a little part of us that's conscious. The rest of us is chugging on all the time. You know, you're out in the street and you're walking and there's a strong wind And you don't think, oh, I must lean into it, otherwise I'll fall over. You just automatically do it because there's all that processing going on. And sometimes we can actually put a little flaw in there when we're feeling too upset and say, I'm not going to pay attention to all of this. Or you get almost numb because you get so much of it, and therefore just to function, you sort of cut off a bit from your feelings. And that doesn't mean they go away, but it makes it much harder to change them in a positive way, or to use them in a positive and useful way. So how do I click this? Okay. 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 So I think the red button, is it? Aha. Okay. And what do I point it at? The screen? Does it go the other way? No. Technology again. You're keeping count, are you? I'll get the score at the end. Okay, so what is ambiguous loss? It's actually a relatively new term. When I say relatively new, it was first used in the 70s by a woman called Pauline Boss. And if you've done any reading about her, you will have seen her name. She was a researcher who at the time was studying families of soldiers missing in action. She described ambiguous loss as a situation of unclear loss, in which it's not known if a loved one is dead or alive, absent or present. And she talked about two different types of loss, ambiguous loss, cases where the person is physically absent, but he or she is psychologically present. So, such as in divorce, or if they're missing, like Pauline Boss's soldiers, or if you have someone who's abducted and you know, or hopefully you know that they're alive, and you're not sure whether they're alive, but they're very present in your head psychologically. And you still have an ongoing relationship with them, even over the ether. And then the cases which are more relevant to us today are cases where the person is physically present, but he or she is psychologically absent. And these are broad terms, and we'll talk more specifically in a minute. For example, after brain injury or some other cognitively debilitating disease, such as a stroke or dementia, where the person's cognition is changed, where they've got some impairments, and those impairments may be as severe as to change the personality or to make them unable to do some things to maintain or nurture a relationship in the same way they did before their injury. And I'm not saying this is for in the case of everyone, but this is, I guess, the area that a lot of carers have some difficulty with. So first of all, to understand loss and grief, I think we need to look at what normal loss is. And at the age of most of us in this room, we have lost someone to death, okay? Someone in our lives who was significant to us has passed away, or we know someone close to us who lost someone in their family. And in a case like that, there's certainty. The person is gone, they're not coming back. There is public acknowledgement of the loss, and that is further sort of enhanced by the use of rituals, which are very common in our society and in most societies, I think, of either a funeral or a wake or a memorial. And that aids grieving. In all of those situations, people talk about the person as they were in life, and they quite often talk about their feelings now that they've gone and the hole that they've left. So the bereaved can process that, and it's out in the open. They don't have to hide from it. It's not, in some families, okay, you don't talk about the dead, and that makes it really hard to grieve. And there is an acceptability of grief. So we expect the bereaved to mourn the loss of the person And we find it quite acceptable. We may find it uncomfortable at times to have someone weeping and us not to be able to do anything for them, but it's a perfectly acceptable, appropriate way to deal with the loss of someone who is significant to you. Following the death of someone, there is a renegotiation of roles. If it's a spouse who's died, then all the things that they used to do, you have to take on board, particularly if you have kids. And there may be changes in the relationship between you and your children. And with friends, there may be a change in relationships too, because you're no longer a couple, you're left on your own. But in the absence of the person, the spouse or the child or the parent or the sister or the brother, it's easier to move on because there is nothing else you can do except move on. There's that certainty that they're not coming back and life must go on. And so there is an adjustment in most cases to the loss over time. Not in every case, and we hear about people who get stuck, who can't grieve for whatever reason. Either they don't want to appear weak, or they want to protect their children or the other family members. And we hear terms like frozen grief or unresolved grief. And so once again, coming back to feelings, while they may not be showing it up here, although you can usually see the subtle signs of a lot more tension and anxiety, it's churning away underneath, and it actually does better. It's one of those better out than in things. You know, it really is, can do some damage if you don't deal with it. And you can get very depressed, you can become almost immobilized and just performing daily things like a robot. And you may be suppressing other feelings too, the good feelings as well as the bad, because that's the only way you can function. So if we look at ambiguous loss after a brain injury of a significant other or a loved one, that's a nicer way to say it, there's usually or quite often a prolonged period of uncertainty where the person's either had the accident or had the stroke or has been diagnosed with a dementia, and you're not quite sure where this is going. In the case of, say, head injury, there's a real fear that person may die, and the doctors may not be giving you the guarantees of any sort at the time, and therefore you're on the brink of not knowing whether you should be mourning them or not. But then there's some hope as a little bit of a recovery starts happening. And as the recovery happens, the hope grows. And you think, wow, she's walking again, or he's talking again, or there's this happening, or there's that happening. It's all going to be fine. And there's the hope that you will get back the person in exactly the same state as you last saw them before the accident or the illness. And for a lot of people, family, when they have their loved one return to them, they find that they are fundamentally altered in some way or other, and some far more severely than others. They can no longer play the role that they used to play in the family and at work and with friends. And consequently, their relationships to others have been changed in each of those areas. They may now, instead of being a very independent person who did everything and helped other people, they're now the person who is dependent for some things and needing help. And that may have been a big part of their identity beforehand. And so that's hard to adjust to as well, that change in identity. So getting back to this, so there's quite often the loss is indeterminate. You're not quite sure what you've lost, if you've lost, how much you've lost, and whether this is just a stepping stone on the way to full recovery. And that is very exhausting and confusing, and takes a lot of energy as well. There's quite often a lack of acknowledgement of the loss, of the relationship and the future plans and dreams you may have had in store. that now have to be shelved. And a lot of people outside the family or who are just casual friends think, well, great, you know, your loved one's back, everything's fine, it's all over. But it may have only just started to begin for you in terms of the changes that you have to adapt to, or that it would be good for you to adapt to. And quite often, because you're so busy and because your loved one is in great need, you suppress any feelings of grief. And you also suppress perhaps other feelings. And I was wanting to have this more as a workshop where I could really interact with everyone and get you to give me your suggestions. Because of the time limits and the nature of this meeting, where there's people in other cities and there's people in other times who are going to be tuning into this, what I've had to do is actually get some examples of what carers have expressed about what they've seen as their losses and their difficulties. And hopefully, and I will ask the people at the hubs and the people here to let me know after we've been through them whether we've missed anything, or whether it rings a bell for you in any way, some of the things that other carers have expressed. And also there's a perceived unacceptability of grieving. So you can't be moaning and crying and weeping and taking to your bed because you've got your loved one back, and there's lots to do. And as I said, there's suppression of uncomfortable or inappropriate feelings, what you think are inappropriate, and they may be conflicting. And there may be things like anger sometimes of, you know, why did this happen to us? We were doing really well beforehand. And it's not just happened to you, it's happened to me and the family. I'll have a slide up in a little while. A wonderful neuropsychologist called Muriel Lezak wrote a paper for the Journal of, I think something, an experimental neuropsychology. And she titled it, "Brain Damage is a Family Affair." And it is. And it's not just family, it's friends and other people who are close to the person. And so because you may be feeling some nasty feelings, in quotes, that you feel would be unacceptable to others, you suppress those feelings and you don't tell anyone about it. There may be a secrecy involved. And it's very confusing because there's still this huge love for this person. And yet there's the person may be very different from the person that you fell in love with or that you loved from a child or whatever. And so the secrecy and confusion and the suppression of the feelings exacerbates your level of stress, exacerbates fatigue, and sometimes causes isolation. You don't, not party on, but you don't mix with people so freely and speak so freely because you're trying to not say things that may upset them. And there's difficulties renegotiating roles and relationships when the loved one is still there and present, because for them, there may be some changes, cognitive changes, that makes it difficult for them to understand what the changes in the relationship are. Not always, and I think it's always good to involve the person who's got the brain injury to see what their experience is. You may be surprised. And quite often feels like a loss of control or choice. Your whole life has been turned upside down as the carer, and you know, you may have to leave work, you may have to take on an extra job if money's a problem, you may have to deal with the NDIS, which is a nightmare, and you may have to learn a whole lot of new skills, putting the garbage out, you know, remortgaging the house, all those things which perhaps your partner or your parent helped you with, or even your adult child helped you with. So ambiguous loss is basically a loss of relationships. You have the person, but the relationship may have changed dramatically. And that's where I put the Muriel Lezak quote. And the whole paper deals with the effect on the rest of the family. And of all the losses experienced in personal relationships, ambiguous loss is the most devastating because it remains unclear and uncertain. I was speaking to Catherine, is it? Catherine? Carlene earlier, and she was saying that she's still going through recovery. How many years? 43 years post-injury, and doing things that perhaps earlier on she wasn't expected to be able to do. So, and we hear stories like that, but we also hear stories where people, despite their best efforts and despite their willingness to change, really find it difficult. And because of the damage, the change may still be occurring and they may be still adapting to their new selves, but it may be a lot smaller changes than where we were used to seeing before the injury, where, you know, hey, they get a new job, or hey, they go overseas, or they get married, or they have babies, or they do other things that are huge changes in their life. So these are some of the remarks by carers, okay? And I'll tell you in a little while where I got them from. They're not carers that I've met personally. So there's Lindsay, whose husband suffered a severe stroke, and I'll just read them for the sake of the people in the hubs who may not be able to see this screen. It just feels like constant grief that never ends. The frustration that there's nothing you can do to make it better, and the guilt for not just being grateful that they survived. Never really being able to move on or to process it fully because you still see them all the time, but you see them as a shell now. Feeling guilty that your loss takes up so much room. Because we have in this room today a couple of the subject persons of all of this who have suffered the loss, I want to, and I wasn't expecting it, I want to say that every one of you is different. And what we're dealing with, I'm dealing with here today, is perhaps at the severe end of the spectrum, where people's relationships may be affected the worst. But, and if I could talk to you, then we could find out what's your story and what's your experience. And she goes on to say, feeling like you bear the brunt of the traumatic stress because they've completely lost their short-term memory. Again, that doesn't happen to everyone. And have no memory of the stroke, the hospital, the rehab, or anything. When you have to tell them over and over again what happened to them, and you get mad at them because carers are humans too, even though it's not their fault that they can't remember that they were in life and death limbo and can't grasp how traumatizing that roller coaster was. So sometimes it's the carer who experienced more of the aftermath, trauma and uncertainty and fear. Because sometimes the brain injured person was too busy in rehab, or their memory hadn't come back yet, or for whatever reason, they were distracted from thinking about it. It's not to say a lot of brain injured people don't feel loss and mourn during the rehab and later. And Lindsay goes on to say, when everyone else in the family wants you to focus on the positive and refuses to process the losses with you, okay? Because they've got the person to worry about, and they don't want to have to worry about you, and nor do doctors. Doctors are so focused quite often on the brain injured person at your sort of check-ins in your reviews that they don't really spend much time with carers. And often something like ambiguous loss is either missed altogether or is misdiagnosed. And they say, oh, you're depressed, here, take these pills. And while it may help a little bit, it doesn't necessarily clear the ambiguous loss or help you process it. And so Lindsay goes on, there's just so much confusion and disorientation, an absolute shock. And life will never be the same. He and I will both never be the same. So this woman's obviously deep in ambiguous loss and knows no way out. She feels trapped. It's impossible to meet new people and start new relationships, presenting a happy, positive face without it coming up as a now dominant part of my life. And people get very uncomfortable. And I don't want to deal with the weight of it. There are no support groups for it. Now, I think there might be now. I don't believe at any grief support groups. I don't belong at any grief support groups because I haven't suffered a death. You can talk to people who have actually suffered a death because they look at you like, or you can't talk to people who have actually suffered a death because they look at you like, I would give a limb to see my father again. So, and you are lucky you get to do that. So what are you grieving? But it's a different situation. And sometimes what we see depends on where we're standing. You know. Now, a different carer, Catherine, says it's a lonely place for a spouse where the survivor of a very severe TBI has made what everyone says is a very good recovery. What neuropsych tests don't measure are personality changes that only immediate family experience. Colleagues and friends and extended family get back the old person, but the spouse and children have someone so different because they're living with them 24/7. Some days can seem almost normal, and then a behavioral episode will bring the painful reality into crystal clarity. So for Catherine, again, she's feeling cut off, that other people don't see what she is experiencing. Are you okay there? Yeah?
Yes, this is all just ringing bells and I can see myself.
Okay, thank you. It was good to hear. If anyone gets offended by this or wants, please tell me.
I'm blessing you. I'm blessing your speech.
Thank you. And here's a different person, Connie. I felt like I was responsible for caring for a stranger. No one seemed to understand the grief I felt and that I should be so happy he survived. So that seems to be a common theme. There were many days I did not agree. And one last carer who has a different background, Jane Cromer was caring for her husband after a stroke. And she's also a psychotherapist. And these women had actually reported these experiences and feelings and confusion to her. So thank you, Janet. Sorry, Janet, not Jane. When my husband, Alan, had a severe anoxic brain injury, some of my losses included leaving a job I liked very much, giving up relationships with colleagues and clients, and limiting personal freedom since Alan could not be left alone. So she lost some of her identity as perhaps an important person at work who other people came to for advice and help. Most of all, we lost the mutuality that couples take for granted. Alan was rebuilding his sense of who he was, and he didn't know anything about me beyond what I did to care for him. His ability to empathize and participate in our familiar roles was gone. He was just not the same Alan or same husband. So Alan's there. He's a new person in some ways. And I'm sure there's windows of Alan that she sees and she values. And in fact, Janet Cromer, as I say in my reference list, she, as I said, was a psychotherapist. And she wrote a book. And this will tell you a little bit more about her husband. The book's titled Professor Cromer Learns to Read, A Couple's New Life After Brain Injury. So there was a fair amount of recovery then, but still some loss of the spousal relationship. In most intimate relationships, you know, when one's up, the other one, or when one's down, the other one can help boost. But if the other one's not able to do that, you're on your own. And we all have different skills, and sometimes that division of labor in the family means that you don't have to do everything. And one thing that I think Janet Cromer was talking about was how difficult it was when she realized she had to remortgage the house because her husband used to do all those things. She had no idea. Okay, so observations by her, which I thought would be very useful. She talks about ambiguous loss is a normal response to a very traumatic situation. Feeling the loss doesn't mean you're not coping well or that you have mental health problems. It does mean you deserve to find help. Ambiguous loss is not the same as depression, but it can contribute to depression, anxiety, conflicts, illness, or explosive emotions if not attended to. I think we all know times when we're feeling resentful or angry with someone about something, and it may be an unreasonable feeling, but it's still there, and it mounts and it mounts and it mounts, and you're squashing it and squashing it and squashing, and then something trivial happens and you blow up, and the other person is, you know, where did this come from? So again, actually expressing your feelings before the blow up can be quite useful. And you counted that one too? Okay. So, and she says it can go on for months or years and lead to physical and emotional exhaustion. So again, it's sort of saying, if you're feeling this, if any of this rings a bell for you, deal with it now, because it's not just going to get better because you will it to. And it's a very hard thing. You've been trying to deal with it on your own. And if that's not working, you need to get some help. And there's a saying about the definition of an idiot is someone that keeps doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So if you've tried everything in your toolbox to deal with what you're experiencing and it hasn't worked, go to someone who's got a different toolbox. Okay. So as a result of the exhaustion and the persisting nature of ambiguous loss, a carer's behavior may become almost robotic, and this can lead to a loss of meaning in his/her life. You just do what you have to do. You do your routine, you go through it, and you no longer set plans or dreams or anything. You just get done what you have to get done. You suppress your feelings, and you become immobilized and stuck. Just like someone who hasn't processed a normal loss, okay? It's there, you're sitting on it, and you're just thinking, I can't indulge myself. But it's not an indulgence. It's a gift to the person you're looking after to make sure that you're as fit and well as you can be in all respects. So how to become unstuck? A man called Viktor Frankl, which some of you may have heard of, but if you haven't, let me just fill you in. He was interned during the last World War in 4 different concentration camps. And he witnessed many people in those camps who were trapped there with him in a painful situation, which had a great deal of uncertainty and no control over their lives. And he watched a whole lot of people in the camps become physically and spiritually beaten down and crushed. And many of them died because they couldn't cope. He survived, but the rest of his family did not. After his experience in the camps, he developed a theory, and he was a psychiatrist, I think, a theory that it is through the search for meaning and purpose in life that individuals can endure hardship and suffering. So it's not enough to stay the robot going on and on and on. Actually, the only way to survive is to find a purpose and a meaning. And he has a lovely saying of, he who knows the why for his existence will be able to bear almost any how. So for many of you who are carers, the why may be, I want to make sure my person is safe and well and as happy and as productive as they can be as well. And if you've even cut yourself off from that and you have lost sight of your values and you're just performing the carer's role because there's no one else and there's part of you underneath that can't do anything else but because your commitment is so huge, then yeah, it bears looking at, and I'll talk about this briefly at the end, of what your values are and what are the sorts of things you can still do that are, give you, the person, not the carer, some purpose and some meaning in your life, as well as reframing what you're doing for your loved one in a way that shows you that your values are, you're living according to your values in a very good way. But perhaps a different way than you thought before the injury. So we'll go through this, and I've put in red, and I'll read it out, what the features of ambiguous loss were. So we deal with each of these in turn. So lack of acknowledgement of the losses, and I say losses because there's identity, there's jobs, there's dreams, there's families, there's lots of different relationships. So acknowledge the problem. So bring it out. Name it. Naming a problem does not make it worse. Just because you expose it to the light doesn't make it any more true or more painful than it does trying to ignore it. And only if you can expose it to the light can you focus on changing it. So the first thing, and this is, I help facilitate some cancer support groups. And I also went through a cancer support group 25 years ago. And the same principles work there of acknowledge what's going on. And then the second one, try and understand what your feelings and everything else are. And there's ways of helping that understanding to grow and to develop. And share your feelings. So that works in those support groups. And I think it would be excellent for people who are having difficulty with ambiguous loss. So the second feature of ambiguous loss is lack of understanding. So you can review what we talked about today, read further about it if you need to, and I've got a couple of things that I think are useful, and gain an understanding of what has happened to you. Talk to others in the family who you trust to share the observations and experiences with you. And it may be interesting to talk to your head-injured loved one who can tell you what their experiences are. And they may have also noticed a difference in the way you're dealing with them now that maybe they don't like so much either. So having that two-way conversation can be very useful. And so there was conflicting inappropriate feelings as another feature of ambiguous loss. So open up and explore your feelings. That feelings aren't necessarily good or bad. They just are. We have, as I said, you can't just say, I'm going to be happy for the rest of my life. It doesn't work like that. They're there, they give you information, and you can't just make them go away. And sometimes the more you suppress them, the more they grumble and affect your behavior in ways that you're not even conscious of. And listen, in the context of ambiguous loss, they're not abnormal or inappropriate. And they don't mean you're bad or mentally unstable. They really just mean you need a bit of help to deal with this. Another thing was the suppression of feelings. So again, acknowledge the feelings and give up the secrecy. Break your silence. Find a safe place to express your feelings. For example, seek an experienced counselor or therapist if you want individual work, or join a support group, which I think has added benefits. You hear other people's stories. You hear other people's ways of dealing with things. And you see people further down the track than you. And then if you stay in the group long enough, you see people, you know, new kids off the block coming that you can then give your helpful advice to. So either face-to-face online groups, write a journal describing how you feel without censoring or judging what you write. So just empty it on the page. You may be surprised what you see, but don't censor it. It's not good or bad or mad. It's just, and you may then think, oh, well, actually, it's more this and it's less that and it's a bit of this, but at least you've got it out on the table and you can deal with it. With lack of control and choice and ongoing uncertainty and shelving of future plans, the way to tackle this is to take back some control. Schedule some time for the activities you're missing that give meaning and value to your life. So you may have had some things in the past that were important to you, that exposed you to new information about something, that exposed you to a different group of people, or helped you build some skills where you felt masterful and great that you could now learn to drive and do those things. But you may have to do it in a slightly different way, okay? You're not going to be able to just get on a plane next week and go to Italy and learn how to cook Italian food. You may have to get a video and watch it. You may have to join a chat group to talk about various things. You may have to, but it will involve scheduling some time And I know time is precious for carers. But if you think you're not just being selfish, not doing it just for you, you are doing it to be a better carer, to be healthier, and to be around longer, and to be a nicer person to be with. And activities that help you regain your identity. So I'm sort of asking people to, if there's anything you can think of that might fit that. If your identity was as, I don't know, a big sister or a person, I mean, you're already now a helper. So if you were a helper beforehand, you're doing a big share of helping, but maybe in a different way, you'd also like to be out there with a team of people helping. And activities that re-establish your relationships with other significant people in your life. So the siblings, the cousins, the uncles who now you're just too overwhelmed to have any dealings with, maybe start an email chat with them, or Skype, or invite them for a barbecue or whatever. Okay, it's a little bit more work, but it'd be good for everyone involved if you had that exposure to a few other people, and that you weren't just trapped in this sort of, as you feel perhaps, trapped in this very singular relationship with the person you're caring for. They probably would like a bit of variety as well. And so that you can make plans and achieve specific goals that are separate from your role as carer. So Janet Cromer added some tips, and she talked about making meaning of the situation. So over time, come to a shared understanding of what's been lost for each family member, and it'll be different for everyone, perhaps, in some way. Also focus on what remains and can be built on. So when my mother was going through dementia, there were windows where I could talk to her in a very truthful and open way, and she was right on the ball, and then those windows would shut. But they happened, and they were glorious, and it was wonderful to have that. And so don't see the person as just one level of functioning. There will be some windows, there will be some times when they can offer a different aspect to themselves, and you need to be open enough to enjoy that. Take the time to mourn whenever you feel the need. Well, obviously, not whenever you feel the need. You may have to schedule a bit of time for that too. But if you can be open whenever you feel the need, well, obviously, not whenever you feel the need. You may have to schedule a bit of time for that too. But if you can be open with some, have a drink and a laugh and this, that, and the other, and you can't go for a whole day shopping perhaps now. It's just not on. There's this and that and the other to organise, and everyone gets tired and cranky, you know, after about an hour perhaps. But to, you know, say, yeah, those were great times, or, you know, that was good. And then see if you can think of a way you can still capture what that gave you, but in a different activity or with some help. And for those, and she says, it's not disloyal to mourn for someone while getting to know the person now present. You're not saying, oh, you know, I don't want anything to do with you because it's the other person I loved. It doesn't happen like that. If you have a child that becomes disfigured, you don't not love that child. You know, you mourn the fact that they're going to have to deal with this and that life's going to be different for them. But you're not going to chuck them out in the street. And perhaps a spiritual practice or faith can offer solace or guidance. Now, some people have a faith or religion that they find supports them, and other people don't, but it doesn't mean you can't have a spiritual practice. And if you're not sure what that means, then perhaps go and have a research about that, because we don't have time right now, but it doesn't mean you have to be religious, but it can be very supportive in other ways. Get to know the survivor as the person he or she is now. So you can gradually rebuild or renegotiate family roles. You can build new rituals and rules to live by. And always with an idea of looking to the future and what new things can do and what new, with a little bit of recovery in some ways, or adaptation that will open up new experiences for both of you. Incorporate humor and fun wherever possible. I'm sure that you find times where nothing else to do but laugh. This is very important, and there's a number of books that talk about this, but it's a tricky thing to talk about in a quick way here. Adopt both and thinking. So that means you become comfortable with the paradox. So, you know, the person, a big part of the person's missing, but they're here. So instead of but, you use and. So instead of trying to think in all or nothing ways, you say, this is Janet Cromer saying, I'm worried and angry about Alan's difficult memory problems, and I know the new strategies we're practicing will help a lot. So it may not be now, but we're working on it and hoping that, you know, the memory book or the signs up or the whatever it is, that new strategies you're using to help that person become a bit more independent and not asking the same question all the time may help. And that's obviously not going to help necessarily in something like dementia, where there's an ongoing decline. Find hope and new options. One of the things about the concentration camps, and for some people trapped in ambiguous loss, is they've lost hope. They feel that nothing's ever going to change. This is the worst it could ever be, and it's probably could get worse if you don't do something, but there is no hope. I'm stuck like this for the next 50 years or more. The situation may not change completely, but you can choose new sources of hope and new things to hope for. So it says adjust what your plans and your dreams and your what your goals were, not your values. Your values probably stay the same. It's just how you meet those values, how you live in accordance with those values. Explore and appreciate all the options open to you to move in a new direction, one small step at a time. And this is the thing for people who are used to being achievers and doing things quickly, but one small step at a time. And then mark what the improvements are and what the gains are. Because, you know, down the track, you can look back and think, well, it was always like this. No, it wasn't. Look back. It's really useful to look back to where you came from and see, wow, life is a lot more different now. It's taken a while, but it's heading in the right direction. One small step at a time. We're both being able to, or we're all being able to. And I'm hoping that you'll all get a copy of this. Pauline Boss is, she's a researcher, and the book isn't that accessible except to therapists. You can read it, but I'm not sure you'll be absolutely enthralled. Muriel Lezak is just the one that spoke about brain injury being a family affair, and it's back in 1988. I don't think it's changed, but she has written things since then. She did some extraordinary things for neuroscience in assessment and tests and things, which I'm the first to say don't measure personality and don't measure a whole lot of things that we depend on the families to tell us. The interviewing the families is one of the most important parts of any assessment, saying you knew them before, what's normal for them and what's changed. But Janet Cromer, I would really recommend to you. She writes very easily and is understandable. And she's got a blog online, and you can contribute to that. You can ask questions, you can put in suggestions and things. Viktor Frankl, it's a very old book. I didn't even put a publishing date because there's been so many rewrites and reeditions and things. But for those of you that are more philosophically minded, or it's quite a profound book, and he's got some wonderful, wonderful sayings, which have become, you know, sort of well-known sayings separate from his book and him. And now, Dr. Russ Harris, and I just need to check with Lauren how much time I've got. we need to get to some questions. Have you got questions? Okay. Okay. Dr. Russell Harris, he wrote a book called The Happiness Trap. And he is and he's online on actmindfully.com.au. Now, I know I looked at some of the previous sessions you've had, and there was someone who was talking, it was a guy, he was talking about mindfulness. And I would fully recommend that to you as a practice. It doesn't mean you're going to become a Buddhist or sit and cross-legged and say all the time, but it's just a way of being in the present. And in the present, you can access your feelings more. You can actually see the good bits around you, instead of if you're just, I've got to wash up, then I've got to do this, then I've got to do that. You don't even feel or see the lovely bubbles in the sink while you're washing up. You don't take time to look at the gorgeous clean pan you've just done. It gets into the cupboard, so you have to get on to the next thing. So mindfulness is a really, and the more you practice, the easier it gets and the more benefits you get. He also talks about dealing with uncomfortable feelings and dealing with pain, and using, one of his techniques is expansion. So you give the pain or the nasty feeling a shape and a color and a size and a texture and everything else. And then, like the Michelin Man, you expand and you leave it there so that it's not the whole of you. And while it sounds weird, if you practice it, you may find it very, very useful. With all of his techniques, as he says in his book, there's no point in just reading the book. It's not going to make a difference, but he keeps reminding you to try this, try that, try the other. And they're little short exercises that help you deal with feelings and not getting trapped by the part of your mind that's always chattering. And quite often, 90% of the time, it's negative. It's, oh, don't go there. Oh, gosh, everyone must think you're boring. Or, oh, I'm just so fat. Or, why did I choose to wear this today? Everyone must be looking at me as though I'm an idiot. So we always, all of us, even the Dalai Lama, has that background noise. He can still it for a little bit of time, but not permanently. And it can get in your way of doing things, of doing the things that you want to do. If you've got someone always nagging you, it's very hard to focus on getting on with the things that add value to your life, getting on with the things that, and it may be just standing and smelling the roses, so he has good strategies for those sorts of things as well, for the thoughts, not challenging them. That's an old psychological technique. It doesn't actually work, and it ends up you buy into it more because you're spending more time trying to deal with a thought. And yet, you can think sometimes, gosh, I'm bright. I'm really quite clever. I've achieved this and achieved that. And other times, oh, I'm so stupid, So how can both those things be true? They're not. So what your mind's telling you is quite often not necessarily true, not real, and it's certainly not helpful when it's negative. Okay? So it's a matter of consciously doing some other things that just turn down the volume. You can't get rid of it altogether, but you can turn down the volume and focus on what it is that you value doing with your life and have a more rich, fulfilling and rewarding life, regardless of the circumstances. Thank you very much for attending. And now for the questions.
I just want to say, I've got a couple of questions here, but
yeah.
Sometimes I felt you were talking about the carer. Sometimes I felt you were talking about the person.
Okay.
So that sort of confused me because I'm trying to get my brain stuck on one thing.
Yeah.
Next minute you're more or less talking about the person with the injury. That's just from my
Okay. Thank you for that feedback. Yeah.
I've got just a couple of things here from Sylvia on the person with brain injury that's found very helpful.
Yeah.
Which might help some other people, and that's vitamin B1, which does help them.
Okay.
She'll tell you about that.
So the nutrition adding that supplement is,
Well, it's just a vitamin
Yeah.
B9 tablet, isn't it, Sylvia?
On a day, how's 40 years?
Helps the memory.
okay.
It helps.
Yep.
And it, I've taken it quite a few times, and it's sort of, you don't notice it.
We might be able, what we
Yeah.
might be able to do after we've had some of these questions, we'll be able to have a bit of a chat and
Yeah.
discussion where we can share.
Well,
Have you got a lot of
While we've
questions from
still
them
got-
too?
No,
Okay.
we don't have questions.
Okay.
While we've still got Sharon up the front, if we've got some questions
Yeah,
specific to
I
them.
have difficulty with Sylvia, and you might be able to answer it. Like, I want to do things like go away.
Yeah.
She's very negative on that, you know, like, she doesn't want to go away. I brought a caravan in to take some away in,
Yep.
but when you go, she goes, oh, but I've still got the house for it. Well, she bloody hasn't, and no matter where you go, you've still got a house for it. But I can't.
Okay. Perhaps small steps. Okay. Small steps. Is that okay? Yeah.
If you can repeat.
Okay. The question, what's your name? Sorry?
Fred.
Fred?
Fred, yeah.
Fred just asked that the problem he has sometimes is that he's bought a caravan, he wants to go away, that's something he values, and he wants to take Sylvia with him.
She loves it when she
And
goes.
she loves it when she goes. I have a partner like that. And he loves it when he goes, but getting them back, absolutely, it can be really tough. So what Sylvia brings up excuses like, I've got too much housework to do.
Oh, she's got to take it with her, which is later, really, because
So Fred's saying, oh, she's got to take it with her,
you've
which
still
is
got
a
to do
load
the
of
dishes and
hooey.
everything.
Yes. Again, small steps. So is it just as hard to get her to go down the road for something, or to?
Hard to go out for tea. I want to take her out for tea.
Okay, so
She refuses to go. She doesn't like clubs, and they've got good meals and that, or some of the pubs have
Okay.
got good meals.
this
And
is
it's
some.
just a break from
Yeah.
the actual house, but you're sort of constant.
So Fred's saying it's a break from the house that he's looking for, and going to the club for dinner where they've got good meals, but Sylvia finds it hard to.
Chips or a salad.
Okay. Again, small steps, and you may need some help, a mediator there who can look at, well, what is it that's stopping Sylvia? What are the thoughts and feelings that come up for Sylvia that make her say, oh, no, it's just easier not to, you know?
I know some of the, when I said go away, I'm sorry, I'll shut up in a second.
That's okay, Fred.
Some of the things that really arose in the last few years is Sylvia started to take her epileptic fits for what? I've had it to the neurologist and that. But they give her a
Okay,
a
so
lot of this stuff, they just give you a tablet, and if you read the instruction, makes you depressed. She's already bloody depressed. She doesn't want any more of that. And
so Fred's raised the thing of that Sylvia has been having some epileptic fits, or it feels like some seizures,
seizures.
and she was
I'm
given
not
a.
sure whether they're epileptic,
Okay.
but, I've got to be there most of the time because I never know when she's going to take it.
Okay, so, and he's got to be there most of the time. I guess we need to look at, if we were working together, can you, in scheduling time for yourself, as well as time, outings together, can you get someone else who Sylvia's comfortable with, that you trust, to stay?
Good dog.
Can the
Anyone else have any questions for Sharon while we're on the screen?
the lady at the back?
So the major negative feeling in the whole of the brain injury and looking after is guilt and grief. Do we see a therapist or a counselor specializing in grief counseling, because everything is becoming more minute nowadays?
Yeah.
When you have depression,
Yes.
somebody angry.
So,
That's my question one.
okay, can I just repeat that question so I've got it right and that other people can hear it? So if the main thing is guilt and grief, would you go to a grief counsellor? And these days with people specialising so much, would that be suitable? And if I can just answer that question before you go on to the next one. if they understand, it's good to ask them, do you deal with ambiguous loss, or are you familiar with ambiguous loss after brain injury? Because they can bone up on it if they're not, and they're the only person that you can find. But otherwise, it would be helpful if they understood that side of things. But most good counsellors would be trying to get into your head and work out, and your body, and work out what is your experience with this, and what are the feelings and thoughts, and what's your situation, and help you find your way through it. And sorry, you had another question?
The next question is, where's family affair? When one is injured, you have got husband and siblings, and everybody has to cooperate. So can the therapist work as a family? The social worker, like,
okay, so in a yeah, in some cases there's a whole family involved, and they've got to cooperate because they're all living in the same house, or they're involved in the same activities. And absolutely, there's some very good family therapists who would prefer to work that way. They may say that someone in the group, or some people in the group, may also need some individual sessions if there's some issues that are particular to them, and for some reason it's not appropriate or helpful to deal with it as the group. So some people have some kind of trauma in the background before they were a member of the family, and that's the thing that's really causing some issues and has been brought up by all of this, in which case then they may need to work on that separately, or they may not. Depends whether it's a secret or whether the rest of the family can assist in listening and understanding what's going on for the person, and it may help clarify why they react the way they do sometimes. Yes, another question.
I'm really interested in what you said about reframing what you're doing for your loved one. And an example of that would be with my daughter. I get very frustrated when she gets out of the shower and she never dries herself properly. It's a small example, but it just made me think, well, how can I reframe that so that it's not an ongoing frustration, because she may not change in that.
Okay.
I'm trying to avoid that sort of continuing
nagging. Yeah.
But I know that I need to reframe how I see it.
Okay, so the question is, when I mentioned reframing, how would what's your name? Meredith go. How would she reframe things when her daughter gets out of the shower and she hasn't dried herself properly? So she's doing the drying, and Meredith doesn't want to continually nag of, it's not done, you're not done it properly, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. How would you reframe what you're doing for your daughter? In your head, or in your daughter's head, or both? Both. Okay. What are you fearful of if she doesn't dry herself properly?
That she may get infections and things like that if she goes around being down all the time.
Okay, so it may be a health issue that you're worried about. And if you think that it's a real health issue, then yes, obviously you need to keep doing something about it. Sometimes you need to look at, well, how big a health issue is it? And do I have to do this every time? Or in terms of, so she is able to do this?
Yes.
So Meredith is saying her daughter can do this.
But she says, I can't be bothered.
She can't be bothered. Okay. And yes, sometimes it's too effortful, or she's in a hurry to do something else, is she? Or
it's more just being able to sort of persevere with those details.
Okay, so it's persevering with those details. So it's close enough is good enough in her mind, and let's, I don't want to have to do this. It's, yeah.
Can I offer one point?
Yes, of course.
Just let it go. Let it go, and she will work it out. What's the most comfortable? Like it won't be comfortable for it. Just let it go. And give her how long
it's still reasonably early days. Yeah.
Yes, and then she will, oh, well, it feels much better if I dry myself.
So Carleen, that's a good suggestion. And you could do it for a trial and say, well, how real are the risks if she doesn't dry herself? But you may find that, no, you're not willing to take those risks. And if it's also helping her become more independent and socially acceptable, so that if she's in a social situation, she's gone for the weekend somewhere down the track, and she doesn't dry herself properly, then the clothes, get stuck and she doesn't look neat, and someone may say, oh, for goodness sake, how come you're tracking water through? Or so there's some practical suggestions here. Sylvia suggested a terry toweling bathrobe.
I would actually find out what she enjoys, whether she likes ice cream or whether she likes watching the TV or whatever. And as soon as she gets out of the bath, if she's not dry,
so Fred's doing a suggesting offering a reward, or if there's something she was going to do that she wanted to do, then denying that. So what we call negative reinforcement, taking away something that taking away something aversive is negative. So it's punishing really what you're suggesting if she was going to get it anyway. But if you think of something new to give her, if you've done really well with drying yourself, how about I bake some scones, or we do this, or you have a lamington or whatever that you've got in the fridge. So no, but
I just meant that if she hasn't dried herself properly, look, now you've put me in a situation where now I've got to dry you. We won't have time by the time I cook tea to do this and that.
Okay, so Fred, is this a strategy you've used? Fred's suggesting that you can say, well, look, if I've got to dry you, then I'm not going to be in time to cook tea, and then tea will take longer, and then we can't do this other fun thing after tea because we'll have run out of time. That was Fred's example. Meredith, any of these things sound useful to you?
It's a personal hygiene thing because, it's like putting on deodorant and stuff like that.
Okay.
And that affects your relationship with other people.
Very definitely. Yeah.
So it's sort of bringing that up to the forefront, and it's, she forgets.
Yeah.
And I'll say, put on deodorant.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Meredith's talking about more than drying. She's saying it's a personal hygiene thing where it's also putting on deodorant or doing other aspects of self-care, which obviously, yes, can impact on the person's social ability and acceptability by others, particularly in summer. Yeah. So that's developing a routine is what Sylvia's talking about. She said it took some time to learn it and to be able to do it automatically, but it's like brushing your teeth, teaching a child how to brush their teeth, not saying that your daughter is a child necessarily, but that at first it has to be purposeful, and you've got to think about it, and it takes time, and it takes a while till you get good at it. But now, I mean, how many of you didn't brush your teeth this morning because you may not even remember actually doing it because it becomes so automatic. So it may be a matter of developing a routine again and laying things out in a line or having a checklist or something that she can follow herself with a reward at the end. Yeah. Or, if she likes cartoons or whatever, if you've got a clever person who can do a cartoon of all the things and she follows it while she's doing that and watches it.
So when you're talking about reframing, well, maybe, so I've experienced frustration with that. So, it's like, maybe I need to change the way I view it.
Okay.
But I also want her to have
Yeah. There's a lovely saying that someone sent to me, and I've got it on my phone, but it'll take me a while to turn it on. And so I'll mess it up a bit, but along the lines of, if your child does something wrong, and we're not saying this is necessarily wrong, but that makes you frustrated, that instead of punishing or getting angry or frustrated about it, if you reframe it as because you think she's just not behaving, she's being lazy, or she's being naughty, or she's being uncooperative, or whatever reason that makes you frustrated about it. If you say, she's having difficulty doing this simple thing that everyone else finds easy, I must find a way to help her with it. So then, okay, what can I use? It's a couple of suggestions around the room. So say, okay, what can I do in order to make this easier for her?
Yeah, I mean, that's the key. She's
Yeah.
having, and I know that. She's
Yeah.
having difficulty.
But it happens every day.
Can I add to that
Yeah.
too? That it, once you've tried all the different things, you've been sensitive, and you've tried perhaps it's routine, perhaps it's storytelling, perhaps it's this or that, and then you debrief with yourself and you said all of these things have been tried, and I've tried this suggestion, that suggestion, the other one, then what else is there to do but leave it alone? Just let it go.
So Carmel's saying, after you've tried all these other strategies, then sometimes you just have to hands off, back off, and leave it alone. And
there's nothing wrong. If there's, no harm that's really going to happen from it. If it's winter time, you put the heater on so that it can the body can happen through heating or.
But I guess in summer, Carmel's saying if it's in winter and you could put a heater on and it wouldn't matter. But in summer, if there's no deodorant and she sweats and there's people around, then it's going to bounce back on her. So maybe you can't leave it alone.
Does it matter? You can ask her, you want to have a smell. What does that smell like to you? If it smells all right to her, then you know what?
Okay. She may not be ready. She may not be ready for that yet, but it's a matter of, I think setting things up to breaking it down to make it as easy as possible. And for you to say, well, yes, it is frustrating for me, and it must be frustrating for her, for me to keep nagging. How can we, solve this for both of us? Okay, yeah. And I think we're running out of time.
Yes.
Carmel? Yep.
Yes, specifically for Sharon, but then we can turn this stream off.
I'm looking for a complex neuropsychologist, or a complex where I have a son who has many different needs, and I can't find anyone to go home. Whenever I take him out to, whether it's Brainman Institute or wherever, the appointments get cancelled because he won't leave. So I have been gone everywhere in Sydney to try to get a neuropsych to come to his home. He has an NDIS plan. I cannot get one. Even though
So we've got a question here that's asking for a recommendation for a neuropsychologist to come home. So we might park that until the end of neuropsychiatrist. We'll park that until the end of this, and I'll just ask if we didn't have any questions through the hubs. Is there any last question for Sharon for the benefit of everyone here and on the hubs on ambiguous loss?
What you have found has been the most successful in helping with dealing with feelings. It's all very good and well to say you've got to let it out, and there's various avenues which you can, but when really none of them are appropriate and available to you, then what? I've found doing a gratitude journal, but then that is actually not addressing it.
No. I think writing, for some people, writing things down is and it needs to be uncensored and not judged as you're doing it. Just let it flow. Write it down and then close the book, come back another time, have a look at it and say, oh, wow, yes, or no, that's not quite what I phrased it wrongly or whatever. And even though the page knows, but you have admitted it to yourself enough that you've put it down. And some people find doing this again and again, telling your story again and again, whether it's to a person or to a page, really helpful, because it helps you understand, and you start to see some linkages about things, and you start to actually see some gaps that maybe you can widen and find some ways, some freedom and some release from some of these feelings.
So we will have to finish the stream. So I'll just say briefly that the question was around the accessibility of some of these supports. And I think I'd just like to suggest that people go back to some of the suggestions that Sharon had written up around increasing understanding and taking control where control is able to be taken, bringing back some certainty into your life. And a lot of those suggestions don't involve anything expensive or any external assistance. So I think going back in there, each of us might be able to find one or two things to try.
But I will say very strongly that if you can find even an online chat group that have similar issues as ambiguous loss, it can be really helpful. You'll always get someone who annoys you, even online, but you may find there's a lot of helpful stuff, and you can just look, you can read other people's stories until you feel comfortable enough if you want to contribute your story. And then it's amazing how many people will actually support you in other countries even, and say exactly, that's exactly how I felt, and this is what I found helpful. Or, wow, you have put into words something I haven't been able to describe myself. And it's been so helpful to actually hear that. And
Thank you. No, we're going to... Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for listening and listening online. I'll just close the stream down.